Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters here on France 24. In today's programme, Shiite militias set up camps around Baghdad in the fight to keep jihadists from the Islamic State group out of the capital. Israel is hoping to force nomadic villages to move out of the desert and into East Jerusalem. Bedouin communities say their traditional lifestyles and livelihoods will be destroyed. And seeking shelter in the desert, the United Arab Emirates sets up rescue centres for victims of human trafficking. Our reporters take us to visit one. Well, we're going to start in Iraq. At an international conference here in Paris, Prime Minister Haider Abadi accused the international community of not doing enough to help Iraq fight back as the Islamic State group edges ever closer to Baghdad. The jihadists overran the capital of the Anbar province last month, the Iraqi government's biggest setback in a year, and prompting it to call for backup. Luke Trago brings us to meet the Shiite militia who are now on the front line south of Baghdad.
Gunfire on the front line to the south of the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, as fighters trade shots with militants from the Islamic State group. The jihadists are just a few hundred meters away.
You see those two houses? That's where they are. There's a whole group of them. They've got snipers and heavy weapons too. They're far better armed than we are. They've got top-of-the-line weaponry.
Top-of-the-line weaponry against outdated machine guns, rocket launchers and a handful of M16s. Firearms limited in number and in the hands of those who have little battlefield experience. Even if they wear the uniform, these fighters aren't professional soldiers. They're volunteers with one of the many local Shiite militias supported by Iran in their choice to take on the Islamic State group.
The jihadists are over there and there. They're very close. They want to take this position at any cost.
The reason's obvious. It would put Baghdad itself within reach of missile fire. Surveillance footage caught the militants' last surprise attack on these fighters' position. They stuffed an armoured vehicle taken from the Iraqi army with explosives and sent it in at high speed. It left 20 of the militiamen dead, further adding to the casualty rates that creep higher almost every day. Now, though,
we've got their codes.
The militia has a new weapon in its arsenal. A radio captured from the enemy, along with the document that reveals what they're talking about.
My car is flying. I repeat, I'm flying with my car.
Translation: major target in sight.
We hear everything they say, conversations, all of it. We found the radio on the body of a dead Saudi.
Behind the front lines, the militias patrol regularly in armoured vehicles. There's always a risk. While villages here are deserted, jihadist cells are known to operate in the area. A bleak state of affairs for a nation that's now known little but conflict for over a decade.
4 years after protesters set fire to it and a national uprising ousted its residents from power, the party headquarters of Hosni Mubaraks are being reduced to rubble. A clean-up of the past that locals are welcoming, even if divisions remain as to how best to use the city centre space in the future. Catherine Clifford reports.
A symbol of decades of autocratic rule under Hosni Mubaraks razed to the ground.
This means a lot. It shows that a nightmare is being banished from the country. We're getting rid of corruption.
In early 2011, angry protesters ransacked and set ablaze the headquarters of Mubarak's National Democratic Party. But it wasn't until last month that the government approved demolition plans.
I've been asked to demolish the building within 3 months. After we finish this, then we will start the second phase to transform it into a garden.
However, the site's fate isn't yet completely decided. With a view on the Nile, the buildings are close to the renowned Museum of Antiquities and to Cairo's iconic Tahrir Square, the epicenter of the anti-Mubarak revolts. Some believe the site could be better used to benefit Egyptians.
It would be better to build a hotel, to employ young people and boost tourism. It would bring income to the country.
In November, a court dropped murder charges against Mubarak for the deaths of some 800 protesters. But he was handed a 3-year sentence in a separate case on corruption charges, along with his 2 sons. Mubarak's NDP party was officially dissolved in 2011, but in July a court lifted a ban on former members running in elections.
Israel wants to move hundreds of families out of tents in the desert and into housing in East Jerusalem. There is one major problem though: the residents of those tents don't want to go. Overall, Israel wants to tear down 46 Bedouin villages. In one, Abu Nawar, locals say the move would destroy their way of life and their livelihoods, a tradition that they can trace back centuries. Claire Williams explains.
A visit from the Palestinian Prime Minister. Dozens of families from this Bedouin community in the West Bank are facing expulsion. The Israeli authorities plan to relocate the residents of Abu Nawar village to a suburb outside East Jerusalem. The Palestinian Prime Minister promised to try to stop the plan going ahead.
These are refugees from 1948, and Israel wants to make them refugees again? That's unacceptable for Palestinians, the leadership, the government, and all international organizations. And we demand more pressure to be put on the Israeli government to stop this plan.
The Bedouin make up most of the population in the Negev desert. They can trace their ancestors in the area to the 7th century. A nomadic community of farmers, they live off the land. Abu Nawar community is home to 110 families. 600 residents live in tents. The village is one of 46 Israel is considering relocating.
We will face the bulldozers, even if those communities were demolished. We will rebuild them again.
We want everyone to help us in staying here. We don't want to live one catastrophe after another.
Israel claims the Bedouin are illegally living on state-owned land and says it will provide housing with infrastructure like water, electricity and sewage. Human Rights Watch says the Israeli military forced the Bedouin to settle in certain areas after 1948, and Israel has since refused to grant most of them land ownership permits. The United Nations accuses Israel of discrimination on the grounds expelling the Bedouin would deny them their culture and means of making a living.
They want adequate access to the international assistance and protection from the international community and from the government of Palestine.
Israel has promised the Bedouin financial compensation, but this economist says the country hasn't properly taken into account how much it would need to pay up.
And in these areas, they are of extreme high economic importance to the Palestinian economy, to a future Palestinian state. And these demolitions create deep social damage, which through compensations will have to be restored. And this is something the Israeli government one day will have to pay.
Israeli authorities have demolished over a dozen Bedouin family homes in the last 2 years. In the late 1990s, they forcefully removed 150 families to pave the way for a new Israeli settlement in the West Bank.
The United Arab Emirates is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, known for its skyscrapers and glitzy malls, but also for some less commendable attributes. Human Rights Watch has documented trafficking and forced labour of workers there and says that despite a law to protect victims of human trafficking passed in 2006, the authorities need to do more. For hundreds, though, help has arrived. Today, 4 shelters welcome the victims in a secure location. Our reporters went to visit one.
We are heading to a shelter. Its location needs to be kept secret. An oasis watched at all times to protect the women from retaliation. This villa houses female victims of human trafficking. It's the 3rd largest traffic in the world after drugs and weapons. These women are among the lucky few who could escape their terrible fate. Domestic workers turned slaves or girls forced into prostitution. 19-year-old Munia fled Iraq to the UAE years ago with her family.
This is where we live. Here we watch TV with the girls.
Munia had always been exploited by her parents, who treated her as their very own slave, but that was only the beginning.
As soon as they thought that I was old enough, I started getting a feeling that my father would want to sell me. Because I was physically mature, he knew he could start making money out of me.
She was sold into prostitution, but eventually policemen went undercover as clients. They arrested her abusive parents and freed Munia from her life of hell. Michaela, a young migrant from Azerbaijan, lives in the same shelter. A year ago, she had moved to the UAE hoping to start a new life.
I was living in Turkey, and a friend of mine knew a woman who was working in a hotel in the Emirates. And he told me that if I agreed to go there, I would be hired as a domestic worker. I would get a salary and an apartment. A couple of days after I arrived, I escaped because I found out I had been fooled. It was not a regular job at all, but something illegal and obscene.
Most Gulf countries often come under fire for violating the rights of migrant workers. But the director of this shelter is proud of her country's programs.
The Emirates could build the largest and fanciest shelters, but our government's objective is to build shelters that look like small houses, a safe haven to bring some comfort to the victims who can live together as a small community.
How many more victims of human trafficking are yet to be saved? There's no official estimation, but the UAE employs more than 400,000 so-called domestic workers.
Well, that wraps up our show for this week. Do take care.